Hello and welcome to the NTI PodTalk. My name is Diane Kaler and I'm Director of Nutrition Therapy Institute. Join me as I talk to interesting people in the field of health and wellness, food and farming, and anywhere else we find conversations that matter to our community. By listening, you'll learn a little about NTI and a lot about the things and people around you that make a difference for your wellness. Welcome and let's get started. Hi there, welcome back to another edition of the NTI PodTalk. This is Diane Kaler, I'm Director of Nutrition Therapy Institute. And today I am so pleased to have our guest, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, who is the author of a lovely book, The Fifth Vital Sign. And I am so excited to have this conversation because without knowing it, I have known about Lisa and have been interacting with people that she interacts with for a while and didn't realize all the connections. So Lisa, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
All right. So, Lisa, you are a fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner. So that is just kind of my very brief introduction about you, but that kind of sets the stage for the topic of our conversation today. Tell us about your background and why you are so interested in fertility, women's health, reproductive health, fertility awareness, those kinds of things.
hmm Well, so I have been in this field of fertility awareness education for over 20 years, which is really wild. I discovered fertility awareness very, very early on. And I mean, when you look back on the trajectory, it seems like it was meant to be. But really briefly, like a lot of women, when I had my first period, it was heavy and it was actually pretty painful. And so, being that I was a teenager in the 90s, girls talk, we didn't have the internet, but I went to my doctor and I just asked to be put on the pill. And before I finished my sentence, the doctor was writing the prescription. And voila, I was on the pill. And my periods, which I'm adding air quotes to, because I didn't know at the time that it wasn't a true bleed when you're on the pill, they became easier to manage. And so, being that I was a child basically and I didn't know anything, I thought I'm fixed. And so I periodically would come off of the pill because I wasn't using it for birth control at the time. But lo and behold, my actual heavy painful periods would always return. So I didn't have the knowledge to explain what was going on at the time, but I did learn early on that the pill wasn't a solution and it wasn't actually helping my actual periods. It was just giving me a different bleeding scenario.
Mhm.
So when I decided that I did need birth control, I decided to come off the pill. And that was also because of the 90s, because they taught us that condoms were effective. So I actually thought that that was a good way to go. And I really had this desire to find out what was wrong with my cycles. I didn't have any friends whose periods were as painful and stuff like that. So I just had the sense that it shouldn't be like that. And I had this history in my family. Several of my aunts had fibroids and needed to have hysterectomies and all this stuff. And I was like, I don't want that to be me. So that's what I did. And right around that time, I discovered fertility awareness charting. So I took to it like a fish to water. I went out and bought Tony Weschler's Taking Charge of Your Fertility. I started tracking, and on my university campus was a group of women, some of whom were instructors and teachers who were teaching this monthly class on charting. And so I started to attend as a participant, and then I became an organizer. And then a group of us took a charting class in my early 20s. And then I went on further to get my my full certification, everything later on. But ultimately, this is where it started. And the reason that I have emphasized the concept that your menstrual cycle is really the fifth vital sign is because early on in my own journey, I discovered that the charting wasn't just about birth control. So initially, I was really excited to be able to track my cycle, to learn that I wasn't fertile every single day, that that was a myth. And I was able to really identify my fertile window and use that as a birth control method. But somewhere along the way, one of my charting instructors, she looked at my chart and she was like, Lisa, your cycles are a bit on the long side and your temperatures are pretty low. You should get your thyroid checked. And I remember
Mm.
thinking like, what? Like, how would you look
Yeah.
at this chart
Right,
and
right.
have anything to know about? And then it
Of
turned out I had
course.
a subclinical issue with my thyroid, and that was identified because of the charting. And so early on, those connections had been made. And that is really where this all started. So, multiple decades later, I'm still in the field. I'm still talking about it. And by this point now, I've written, 3 books about the topic and done just an immense amount of research to really bring that to the world, because so many women don't even know that they're not having a true period on the pill. That's what we're taught. We're taught the pill is going to regulate your cycles and make your periods easier. They don't tell you that it allows you to not have a period at all, and it replaces your true menstrual bleed with a withdrawal bleed, right? So that's in a nutshell where this all
Yeah.
started.
Well, and I find it so interesting that young women, girls, are not taught about the biology of what's going on in their own body. And I certainly wasn't. I'm older than you are. I was experiencing all of this stuff in the would have been the late 70s and early 80s. I was in college in the early 80s, and I had no idea about, I mean, I knew that I was having cycles, but I didn't know anything about the timing. I didn't know anything about, the hormones and what's going on with the hormones. I didn't know anything about follicular phase, luteal phase. And, I don't know if girls need to actually know the nitty gritty, in-depth details of the science. I don't know that they would be interested in that, but just like knowing some basic things about their own biology and physiology, that is just not something that comes up ever, unless they seek it out. And, I certainly didn't learn about all this stuff until I was way into my 30s. So you did it much earlier than I did. You were smarter than I was to start thinking about it at an early age. But I don't know. I think it's almost a tragedy that it's not more discussed, and girls, young women have more empowerment about themselves and what's going on in their body.
Well, I mean, to your point, because you kind of alluded to, like, do we really need to know all the science behind it and everything? And in a sense, I agree with you. But I remember high school, and your high school probably wasn't that different. Like, we learned a lot about the ear, okay, and like the eye, and all this stuff. And I'm not like, obviously, I like to hear; it's wonderful.
Right.
But but the point is that we learned about all this intricate biology about all these different parts of the body that is very interesting. But the most practical aspect of it, whether you have children or not, if you're a woman of reproductive age and you're cycling, this is a huge part of your life. Having your periods on a regular basis, there's so many things that can go wrong with their periods. I don't go around broadcasting what I do, but if I'm ever in a social situation, someone's like, "Oh, what do you do?"
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I
Right.
tell them, all of a sudden I hear all of the stories every
Wow.
time, because
Yeah.
everybody has experiences with their cycle, and so many women have had negative experiences, cycle challenges. They've gone to the doctor, been told to go on the pill, not really been given answers. So arguably, it's shit. Like, why not? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the ear stuff was interesting, but like,
Mm-hmm.
why isn't the menstrual cycle and the
Mm-hmm.
reproductive cycle just taught commonly in high school biology? Like, that doesn't make sense at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it doesn't. And even if it were an all-girl setting, I went to a Catholic school young, but it was you know, mixed. It wasn't an all-girl school, but I did know girls who went to all-girl high schools, and even in an all-girl setting, it still wasn't something. I mean, I can kind of see where if there's boys in the room, it can be uncomfortable, but even in all-girl schools, they didn't talk about it. So at least back then. So yeah, I don't know what it is about that. It's the whole thing is crazy. All right, so but this is why, as you talk about fertility awareness, it's not just about knowing about getting pregnant or not getting pregnant. It is about knowing much more about yourself. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Understanding fertility awareness for a bigger purpose.
Absolutely. I mean, to your point about how much every woman needs to know. So even though I'm deep in this topic, I don't think that every woman on earth should necessarily be using this as their primary birth control method. I think we all have our own preferences, and ultimately it's good to have options. So in terms of what I think we all should know, I think that every woman and man should have the opportunity to learn
Yes.
about how the menstrual cycle works so that we're all just aware of it. We should learn the kind of fundamental basics that you're not fertile every day, that that's a myth, that we do have a window, within the female reproductive cycle, there is a window of time where pregnancy is possible. And that window typically coincides with our cervical fluid production. And we should learn about, just the basics, like the average cycle lasts anywhere from 24 to 35 days. Typically, the average is about 29 days. We start with the menstrual period, and I could go into a little bit more detail about what that looks like. And then, once your period is over, you're into that pre-ovulatory phase as you approach ovulation, where our, follicles are developing, which is, the little fluid-filled sac that contains the egg. And as you approach ovulation, that's when our ovaries are making our reproductive hormones, estrogen, predominantly at that time. And the estrogen is what causes that mucus production. It's what triggers the endometrial lining to develop. And once you do ovulate, then instead of, we still produce a significant amount of estrogen, but it's only after ovulation that we make that progesterone. And then the progesterone has a different effect. It actually, stops and suppresses that mucus production. It helps to further and fully develop that uterine lining to prepare it for pregnancy. It has that thermogenic impact on the body, which is why we can take our temperature and confirm when we've ovulated, because there's a, subtle temperature increase that happens after we've ovulated. So even just having that basic, that isn't even like what I just described isn't that complicated. I feel like it's perfectly reasonable for us to have that information. And I think to kind of go into your point of this isn't just about contraception. So there's this very practical application of fertility awareness, obviously, for a lot of women who have just negative experiences with hormonal birth control. They've had a variety of side effects. I've spoken to so many women who it just didn't work for them, and they were really looking for an alternative, but no one ever told them that there are reliable non-hormonal alternatives. So they really feel kind of trapped, like there's nothing I can do. So it is really helpful to know that there are modern fertility awareness based methods based on tracking the cycle, not the rhythm method, that have a high degree of evidence behind them. So highly scientific, with efficacy as high, perfect use efficacy as high as 99.4%, when used correctly, when you use a specific type of method. The symptothermal method with kind of a pre-ovulatory, post-ovulatory double check, so kind of having different parameters to check for in terms of identifying that fertile window, consistently shows the highest efficacy. So even just being aware that that is a possibility, I think is really useful. And then, of course, the implications for when you're trying to conceive. A lot of women find out accidentally when they're trying to conceive that you can't get pregnant on every day. Contrary to what we were all told, they're having all the sex, but like the pregnancy isn't necessarily happening in the time frame that they anticipated. And then they kind of accidentally realize that, oh, wait, there's a window, and that's when I have to have sex in order to conceive. But beyond those practical applications of it, when you really learn about the menstrual cycle, when you really learn about those normal parameters, then we can look even deeper to define it as just a sign of health. So, that's why I always argue that the menstrual cycle should be looked at as the fifth vital sign. So if you think about some of the common vital signs, like your blood pressure or your heart rate, we all kind of have a sense that if you were to go to your doctor and he takes your vitals, there's a normal range. And so take blood pressure, for example. If the blood pressure is too high, not only does it tell your doctor that there's something wrong, but they know a short list of reasons why it could be high versus too low. So it even gives them a roadmap for where to start looking. So similarly with the menstrual cycle, it could be as basic as understanding that, when you have your cycle, there's a short window of time when we would expect to see cervical fluid. So cervical fluid can look like creamy white hand lotion. It can look like clear, stretchy, raw egg whites. And if what a normal cycle looks like, we would expect to have, let's say, 2 to 7 days of mucus within those parameters. And then after ovulation, we would expect it to mostly go away. So if you have a woman who has it every single day, she's got some sort of discharge, every single day of her cycle, that the most basic thing could be like, oh, she could have an infection. But beyond that, I mean, if you have a woman who is of reproductive age and she just doesn't have a period for 8 months, I mean, that is, for example, hypothalamic amenorrhea is a good example of why that can happen. And that's characterized by, way too much stress, not enough food. So under eating, over exercise, and stress. And women who go extended periods of time, 6 months or more without a menstrual cycle, are at a higher lifetime risk of things like osteoporosis. Like there are women who've had extended HA who literally are diagnosed with osteoporosis in their 20s. And so
Wow.
there's a clear link. And
Mm-hmm.
another example could be PCOS, where,
Mm-hmm.
characterized by long irregular cycles. So they are cycling, but you have maybe 45 days, 50 days, 60 days in between. So irregular cycles are associated often with issues of insulin resistance, glucose intolerance, and other cardiovascular, metabolic type issues. And women who fall into that category have a much greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes later on in life. So we're looking at it like, oh, this is cool to chart your cycles, which it is. But
Mm-hmm.
we can also just gain a much deeper insight into what's happening with a person's overall health by understanding that link between the menstrual cycle and our overall health.
Right. And usually what you get if you were to go to, a medical practitioner, and if they do ask you anything about it, they ask, are your cycles regular?
Yeah,
Right?
that's it.
And for someone who doesn't know what a regular cycle is, or what an optimal cycle should be, to them, it may be regular. It may be regular to go for months without, like they don't know, like regular and optimal or biologically ideal, like, these are all words that you can throw around, but regular is not a good assessment to use to identify any kind of reflection of health that your cycle is giving you. I mean, it's just like, for us, we're, nutrition therapists, and we talk a lot about bowel movements, and like, so I always say to our students and grads, don't ask, are your bowel movements regular? Because regular to one person is different than regular to another person. And so you have to be more specific in the questions that you're asking. And it's the exact same thing with this. If you're actually going to, because that information can be so useful about more broad health effects, just like with you, you discovered you had a thyroid issue by not having optimal cycles, which you didn't know would be the case had you not really delved into this. So yeah, I think that it's, I don't know.
Well, and I thought of something as you were saying that, which is if you ask a woman if she has regular cycles, who doesn't know that when she's on the pill, it's not a true menstrual cycle. She could literally be on the pill and be like, yeah, my cycles are regular. And like that
Yes,
provides absolutely no information.
yes, yes. And that's a whole other thing, because it's artificially been normalized or regularized to them, but they don't know that it's an artificial artifact. Yeah. All right. So you mentioned the word food, and I've mentioned nutrition. So let's talk about, because we are a nutrition school, our audience here is really interested in nutrition. So talk about recommendations and things you talk about in your work about the influence of nutrition in fertility and menstrual cycle.
Well, so in the latest book, I'll just mention the latest book I co-wrote with Lily Nichols, Real Food for Fertility. We took a huge, just deep dive into nutrition to support fertility. And what's interesting about that is that, of course, that resource is intended for women who are trying to conceive or thinking about it in the future. But for me, I also think about it in terms of all of my clients who are just working towards optimizing their menstrual cycle health. Because ultimately, when your cycle is optimal, when it's the way it's supposed to be, when your hormones are balanced, when it's falling into normal parameters, that is going to coincide in a lot of ways with just having healthy fertility. So it's interesting because when you bring up a topic like, nutrition for fertility, I think a lot of people, potentially a lot of people outside of the nutrition world, might just think, okay, so I want the list of supplements, like what
Right,
am I going to take, right, to make
right,
this all work?
right.
And we're so trained to think that way,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to just the way our allopathic medicine system is like you go and they give you stuff for it.
Yeah.
So when we are looking at nutrition to support optimal fertility, it really starts with the foundational pieces, like the foundational pieces of nutrition. Like one of the most important things is to balance those macronutrients. So when we're looking into the research in a variety of different areas, it is essential to have sufficient protein and to
Mm-hmm.
have sufficient fat, preferably animal fat.
Mm-hmm.
In some circles that can be controversial to say.
Yeah, not
And
here.
excellent, of course. But
We
it's
even talk about liver and organ
there
meats.
you
So
go. So we're all on the same page. This is
yeah.
wonderful.
Yep.
But it's really interesting because I think the aspect that I bring into it is the menstrual cycle because I mean, I love diving into the research, and we had so much research that we cited that we had to take it out of the book. Like we have a separate there was like 200 pages of citations that we had to like take out of the book. But what I bring to it, I think the unique aspect of it is when we look at the menstrual cycle, we can, learn about what the research has to say, but then we can watch how it plays out in real time. So let me give you more of a tangible example of something that we see all the time. When women start to chart their cycles, then all of a sudden it's like right there in front of them. Are you ovulating? When are you ovulating? How long is your cycle? And how long are the different aspects of your cycle? So in the pre-ovulatory, like if a normal menstrual cycle ranges from 24 to 35 days with an average of 29 days, then ideally we would actually expect to have about the same amount of days in that pre-ovulatory phase as the post-ovulatory. So in order for the cycle to fall into that range, ovulation would have to happen somewhere between days, let's say 10 and 22, like in order for the cycle to actually be that long. And in a healthy cycle, that second half of the cycle, the luteal phase, we would expect it to be at least 12 to 14 days. So it's very common for, when you start to chart your cycles to kind of start to notice, like, wait a minute, my luteal phase is only like 9 days or 8 days. And I'm having all of these other signs that are, coinciding with having low progesterone. So I feel like often when you're thinking of those things, you start to think about different supplements and different things that we should be doing to support that. But what we have found with our clients and what we found in the research is we really need to start with sufficient protein, which is typically higher than the basic recommendations.
Yep.
And especially for women who are active. So I feel
Mm-hmm.
like lately I've been working with a lot of women in that kind of mid 30s, like 30s, early 40s range. And we're busy, we're exercising a lot, we're skipping breakfast. Maybe we saw one too many influencers talk about intermittent fasting. So we're like not eating 3 meals a day. We're not eating breakfast. Maybe we're drinking that coffee in the morning instead of breakfast and wondering why the menstrual cycle isn't balancing. And before you jump to all those supplements, getting sufficient protein, preferably from animal sources when possible, making sure that you're not accidentally under eating fat. So I think the 80s and 90s, like that whole calories thing and the fat phobia stuff, it still plays into it.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just so essential to start there. I mean, to go a little bit broader, the title of the book being Real Food, it really starts also with defining what that is. And
Yes.
in terms of like, we're not like purists so that it can't be in a package ever. But I think one of the great aspects of the definition is just that when you look at it, you know what it is. Like if I look at white sugar and white flour, I don't know what it came from. It could have
Mm-hmm.
come from anything. But
Mm-hmm.
starting there with those basic foundations, I think is huge. And then understanding what key micronutrients and, support optimal fertility and health. So you mentioned liver and organ meats. To get into the weeds, we talk more specifically about incorporating liver and organ meats, incorporating fish and seafood for the omega-3 fatty acids and all the different micronutrients. Of course, incorporating green leafy vegetables, incorporating
Mm-hmm.
fermented foods, incorporating, soups, stews, bone broths for the collagen and all of the different nutrients there. So I will pause because I feel like I'm kind of going in a little circle, but I
No,
can't
yeah.
stress enough how it starts with getting enough protein. It starts with and getting enough food overall. And then from there, we can really optimize for micronutrient density.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You are totally speaking our language here at NTI. This is all the same stuff we talk about. I think it's so easy, particularly for women, once again, to undereat generally and undereat protein and fat healthy fats because they think that eating fat makes you fat. And of course, women, you know, don't want to intentionally cause themselves to gain weight. And so they believe that they need to undereat these things. And, we talk about food first, and making sure that before you start jumping to supplements and all the magic pills and all the latest, whatever nutrient or things that come in a pill, whether they be a nutrient or a phytonutrient or whatever, these very isolated, highly concentrated, extracted substances from some really obscure, plant in
The
wherever.
superfoods, like you
Yeah,
need to buy this berry that only grows in this mountain, and then you
right,
need to do
right.
that.
Yeah.
It's
And
like,
then you think,
well,
well, you know, maybe 5 people had access to that,
yeah.
in their lifetimes. And how is it that all the rest of humankind was able to continue to reproduce year after year without having access to that thing? And now suddenly we need to spend $100 a month on getting it. So anyway, yeah, it's totally, we are all about food and making sure that as much as possible, the foundation of your diet is real food, whole food. And, a lot of people get squeamish about eating organ meats and even thinking about eating organ meats. But of course, organ meats are some of the most nutrient dense foods there are. If you just look at, nutrition comparison from organ meats to other things, you'll see that numerically. So love it. And, this sort of general nutrition advice is not only for optimizing menstrual cycles and fertility, it's also about those very narrower medical diagnoses that people get, like PCOS and endometriosis and those kinds of things. Same thing applies. Nowhere am I saying that you can address these things solely with diet, although I think in many cases you can.
Some people, it depends on the person,
Yeah,
like,
I think there's possibility, but I don't want to make any sort of
yes.
claim that everyone can get resolution to their medical conditions from diet. But I think it's pretty challenging to get any sort of resolution without making a dietary change.
Well, and one of the things I was alluding to, like, the menstrual cycle aspect of things as well. And one of the things that can happen, and we highlight certain conditions that, like you said, might need a more targeted approach
Mhm,
depending on the person. So
mhm.
if somebody has insulin resistant PCOS, they would benefit from balancing their macros and upping their protein, but depending on the way that they respond to that initial approach, they may have to then further look at their carbohydrate intake and maybe focus more on the low glycemic options, and just to further tailor it to what their specific needs are. We have an entire chapter on overcoming hypothalamic amenorrhea, and in that chapter, we really explored just even kind of the psychology around it, because
Yeah,
HA is a really interesting condition where it's behavioral. It's the behavior of not consuming enough and exercising a lot. And so overcoming it, it's not, like you could just be like, eat more, but that's
right.
it. You have to overcome it. But when you look at the research, there was a really interesting study that we shared that looked at the macronutrient intake of women who were, not having their period due to HA versus women who were cycling. And the women who were kind of on that HA spectrum, as we like to call it, tended to specifically undereat fat and
Mhm,
specifically undereat protein compared to the women who were cycling. And
mhm.
so, one of the things I think also is you can teach this stuff, but then if someone has been undereating for a long time, they may really underestimate what they need to eat to sort out their cycle. So they might think to themselves, like, you might get them to a point where they're actually eating way more than they ever have. and it might not even be enough. And so this is where I like to bring it back to the menstrual cycle. So when we talk about using the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, chart your cycles. If you want to go deep into the weeds, you can chart your cycles in a specific way. Look at the mucus patterns, look at the whole overall presentation. I mentioned that luteal phase length, which can be really helpful in just gauging the balance of hormones. Because if your luteal phase is consistently 9 days, for example, and I shared that the optimal is 12 to 14, then even if you're eating more than you ever have, it's not enough because your body is still telling you that it's not enough. And
Yeah,
so
interesting. Yeah,
this is one
that's
of
a
the
great
ways
way.
that, well, yeah, because then we get out from the cookie cutter, everybody needs to do da da da, and then we start
Mm-hmm.
looking at, well, what does your body need?
Mm-hmm.
And it also, what I've found in my client work is it takes the conversation away from like, I think you should do this, because that's like not useful, right?
Right. Right.
Versus like, okay, so you've been doing X, you've been doing Y, you've been doing Z. And let's look at what your menstrual cycle is doing. You're initially last, 2 cycles ago, this is where we started from. You've made some significant improvements, but it's not where it needs to be. Or it could be, okay, well, you've been working towards this. You haven't had a cycle in a year. We're starting to see some signs of ovulate, like we're starting to see some signs of follicular function. We're starting to see some mucus, but your period still isn't back. So it really gives you that gauge of, are you actually doing enough? Like, because we can get in our heads, right, about what
Mm.
we think we should be eating and what we
Yeah.
think and all of that. And I feel like that cycle piece of it takes it away from that and gets it into the real, like, what do you really
Mhm.
need for your body to
Tangible.
work?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because people, they need to see some sort of outcome in order to stay on track with something. If they're not seeing an outcome in whatever direction, if they're not seeing that outcome, they have less of a connection to it and less to grab onto and, as I said, be tangible. So I love that. And I want to talk about something else before we go on. And I have a question that I get a lot when I talk about this stuff is that, for optimal fertility and optimal menstrual cycles and all that kind of stuff, I talk about, eating more and having more body fat, not obesity or overweight, but having more body fat and all those kinds of things. And the question I always get back, and I actually don't have a great answer, so I'm looking to you for an answer. Um, the question is, well, how do you explain women who live in situations, usually third world countries, where they obviously, well, I'm not going to say obviously, where they perhaps don't get enough food. They certainly don't have access to many animal proteins and animal fats, and yet it seems like they get pregnant very easily, and reproduction is very pregnancy comes easy to them. And they're not eating a lot, and they're oftentimes malnourished. And so how are they able to get pregnant and have babies? And this is a question that I get asked a lot. And I have my own way of thinking about it, but I'm curious what you would say to that.
I mean, of course, I have a lot of different ideas that come to mind right away. I think it's always hypotheticals, right? These
Yeah,
hypothetical questions.
right.
So I would say that there's a lot of different factors that affect fertility. I would also imagine that if we were really looking at the data, that a lot of these women are getting pregnant young from young ages. So
Yes.
it's a different conversation around if she's getting pregnant easily at like 19 and 20 and
Mm-hmm.
21
Mm-hmm.
versus somebody who's like,
In their
38
30s.
and,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, or whatever the case. So I feel like there's a lot of different factors. And then we would have to look at the data because there's so many assumptions in that question.
Mm-hmm.
The
Right.
assumption that everybody in these lower just lower economic places
Mm-hmm.
of the world,
Mm-hmm.
there's an assumption that everyone's just getting pregnant all the time.
Right.
And when you look at the data, I mean, when I was looking at some of the fertility data to write the male fertility chapter in particular of Real Food for Fertility, a lot of these countries are really struggling with fertility issues. They're so more than you would think. So the population may be high because a lot of people may be having babies young, but they also have a huge population. So we don't know if, so I'm trying to say this in the
Mhm,
best way, but if there's this huge
mhm,
population,
mhm.
then it's still going to look like quite a bit of children. But if
Right,
we don't even know what percentage of
right,
those
what the rate
people,
is.
yeah,
Mhm,
are not getting pregnant. So I think
mhm,
that ultimately, when we actually look at the data, I was a
mhm,
little bit surprised to see how high the infertility rates were in some of these other countries. So
mhm.
I think that we
Interesting.
really have to look at the actual data to see what it's saying, because don't think for a minute that the food scarcity, the lack of nutrition, don't think that that is not having an impact on
Mhm,
fertility, right?
mhm,
So
mhm,
that would certainly be one of the things. And then we could get into the whole other conversation about how, well, in our nation, you know, we don't have the food scarcity, but we certainly have a
mhm,
cultural aversion to younger women having babies.
mhm,
So when we're at the biological prime, we could talk about egg quality and how age is the most significant factor in terms of egg quality, and how there's a decline, and it's again all the controversial things. But we can talk about how in our culture right now it is far more acceptable for a woman to start trying for her first baby in her mid 30s than it
mhm,
would be for her to even consider having a baby when she was 19.
mhm.
And how does
Yeah.
that affect the overall fertility rates to be actively discouraging? And I'm not saying that this is the answer. I'm not saying
Yeah.
everyone go have a
No,
baby
no,
at
no.
19, but I'm just
No.
saying, like, if we looked at it from a purely biological standpoint, that would be the
Yeah.
time to have babies.
Right.
And, you know,
Right. Yeah. That's a great answer. And I caught you off guard with that. But it's so funny that you say that, now in our culture, it wouldn't be uncommon for someone in their mid-30s to just start be wanting to have children. My grandmother had my mother's youngest sibling at age 31. She was 31 when she had him. And I remember so clearly, she told me she was so embarrassed to be a 31-year-old woman and be pregnant because her previous children, she started having babies when she was 19. And then my uncle, what was a late life surprise, and she said she was so embarrassed to be pregnant at age 31.
well, and how times have changed,
Yes,
right? Like,
yeah.
and now, and so this is something as well. Again, it's always a little bit controversial, but so there was this paper that I was reading, and it was talking about this whole idea of women delaying childbearing into the later years. And one of the things that it said, and I'm not quoting verbatim, obviously it's been a while since I read this particular study, but it was talking about when women are planning to have children, you should take a lot of different things into account. And the later that you start, some women are able to achieve however many children that they want with a late start. So if you decide you wanted 3 and you start at 35, for some women, they're able to achieve that. But for others, if they start late, they may not have the opportunity to have the number of children that they had initially wanted. And so that too could play into this whole idea of why is it that the fertility rates are different, and all of those kinds of things. So you can tell how my mind works, right? And I kind of go into all of these things, and I've read a ton of research in this area. And I think we should just be having an open conversation. One of the
Mhm.
things we talked about, the biology not being discussed in, high school class, biology class, and all that kind of stuff. But we could also talk about why we don't educate young women about fertility. I've had so many conversations with women who have been on the pill for like 15 years, and maybe now they're in their 30s, and they're still like just as terrified of getting pregnant on every day of their cycle, because that's what we were programmed in high
Right,
school.
right.
At what point do we start educating our young women about how fertility changes, and how it can take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years for your body to fully normalize after coming off of contraceptives, particularly when you've been on them for long term? At what point do we start educating our women and men about how to optimize their fertility, how to start thinking a little bit more about how our fertility changes with age, so that we're not always in that 20-year-old mindset of thinking that everything's just
Right.
gonna happen immediately. Like,
Right.
how do we change this conversation? It's like really needs
Yeah.
to change.
Yeah. Yeah. Throughout life, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, this brings us to talk about your mentorship program. I'm really curious to hear about it, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. Talk about who you designed this for, who is eligible to participate in your program. I think our community and our graduates would be really interested in hearing this because we do have a lot of graduates who, once they leave here, they really want to focus on fertility and prenatal health and that kind of stuff. So tell us about your program.
Well, I mean, thank you for the opportunity to share about it. Interestingly, when I first started in the fertility awareness world, I anticipated that I would be working one-on-one with women throughout, the duration of my career. But inevitably, what started to happen is a lot of women's health professionals would be reaching out to me and saying, I want to do what you do, and where did you go to learn the different techniques and skills that you are teaching now? And so ultimately, this program came out of necessity. Although there are many different fertility awareness programs out there that teach practitioners how to teach charting, there are very few, if any, that are actually equipping practitioners with the protocols necessary to not only teach, but to support their clients with complex charting, with fertility challenges, and just with the barrage of things that come when you start charting. So to give myself as an example, I mentioned that I started teaching quite young. So I was pretty young and pretty naive. And I had charted my own cycles, right? So you kind of think that your clients are going to come to you with fairly straightforward cycles and they're just going to want to learn how to chart. They're going to want to use the method for birth control or conception. But what happens in the real world is as soon as you start offering charting, then your clients are coming to you with other issues and those issues show up in their charts. And so you need to have a way to actually support them. So ultimately in the mentorship, you asked who is eligible. This program is designed specifically for women's health professionals. So certainly the graduates of your program would be welcome. And we've had a variety of practitioners from, midwives, nutritionists, women's health coaches, even, PTs, physical therapists, other
Sure.
body workers. So quite a few. And I think what our practitioners love about it is our kind of commitment to research. So we provide a ton of different resources and all of our protocols that we share for a variety of different menstrual issues. We not only provide, citations and all that, but we provide the full text resources so that whenever we've made certain recommendations or have them listed in our protocols, our practitioners, if they want to, can go straight to those full text papers to kind of have that really deeper understanding of where it's coming from so that they can feel a lot more confident about making those recommendations to their clients.
That's awesome. Well, that's great. And I think our graduates will be happy to hear about a resource for continuing education, because once someone chooses to go to, post-secondary education as an adult, um, they can't stop, right?
Yeah, it opens the floodgates. There's
Yeah,
so much more to know.
I know. Once they start learning and they start, they start delving into their passion, they realize the various different offshoots of that passion. So I think that our graduates will be happy to hear about your program. Um, so, what I'm going to ask a question that I'm not expecting you to give me the answer to, and we sort of have already talked about it, but why do you think that healthcare systems, like very conventional healthcare systems, don't integrate this type of information into their practice? We talked about there is this sort of, lack of knowledge and doctors don't talk about it, but do you have any ideas on why is it? And what steps do we as practitioners need to take, or even as consumers, to create demand for this? Can you talk about those two things that are sort of interrelated?
Oh man, I feel like I could talk about it all day. But in terms of why I don't think that it's a part of it, I feel like, because this is a conversation I have a lot with and I imagine you do the same with your practitioners and your clients. So I feel like it starts with understanding what we're dealing with. So I always teach with silly analogies. So, if I were to go into McDonald's and like I'm standing in line and I want the guy to like change my tires, you would think I'm delusional. And now we have TikTok, so someone would be recording me and like, why can't you change my time? Right? It's not the right place.
Right,
So I
right.
think the first thing is for us to really understand Like, what is it that conventional medicine is? Like, it is
Mm,
allopathic medicine. It is a pill for every ill. That's literally what it is. It's
right.
literally that. So when you
Mhm.
go, they're trained to suppress symptoms with medication. They're trained in surgical techniques, right? They're trained in a very specific way of looking at disease, and it is not root cause functional medicine. So the
Mhm.
first thing we have to know is like, what, like, you're at McDonald's, but you're asking for like someone to change your tires for your car. Like,
All
we
right.
have to like acknowledge that if you want to get your
I
tires
love
changed, you
that.
gotta go to the place that changes the tires.
All right, good. Yes. You have the perfect analogy for it. That is definitely the right way to think about it.
So that's the first thing.
Mhm.
And then, it's funny because I do this research series on my podcast. And so I find these interesting studies and I go on about them on my podcast in not a crazy way. I actually talk about it like systematically in a way that makes sense. But I found this study and it was talking about doctors' knowledge about fertility awareness-based methods. And that kind of stuff isn't always easy to find. So whenever I find something like that, I get really excited. But it was very enlightening because they did a survey and they shared qualitative and quantitative data. So they actually shared some of the responses from the physicians. So specific to like fertility awareness-based methods, let's say, because that's my field, most physicians aren't even taught about it. So in medical school, and I've had the opportunity to interview a lot of doctors, so I always pick their brains, but in medical
Right.
school, for example, they're not taught about nutrition. If you
Mhm.
ask a doctor what they were taught in medical school about nutrition, they might tell you that they had a class or like an
Mhm.
afternoon.
Right.
Like that's it.
Mhm.
And with fertility awareness based methods, so their doctors are trained in such a way that obviously that the pill is literally the cure for it all.
Yes.
So they're
Right.
trained, they're taught this is a normal menstrual cycle, right? 28 days, blah, blah, blah. And
Mhm.
if anything goes outside of that, anything,
Mhm.
it's pill,
Mhm.
pill, 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 pill. They're also taught to really prioritize the quote, most effective methods. And so, from that medical perspective, they are looking at methods that minimize the chance that the user can mess it up. So they're trained to
Yes.
think, okay, the best method for me to recommend would be the IUD because it's in there. She can't mess it up.
Right.
Like the injection, right? The
Yep. Mhm.
implant,
Yeah,
the
because you
like,
don't have to think about it at a certain
yeah,
time every day.
even the patch or the ring, right? Because again, and so even within hormonal methods, like they're trained. I'm not saying all doctors do this exact same way, but I'm saying like the mentality is efficacy over everything.
Mhm.
And then fertility awareness based methods are the opposite because they are entirely user dependent. So we have a
Right.
disconnect in terms of what is even prioritized.
Yes.
So they're very far less inclined to talk about them. But then when fertility, if they're presented at all within medical school, they're typically presented grouped in with rhythm methods and other unreliable methods. So the doctors are already predisposed to think that they are not going to work. So
Mhm.
there's a couple things I want to point out in this study because I think it was really interesting. So it was like a very small percentage of doctors even had any training at all. It was maybe like maybe 30 to 40% of the doctors who responded said that there was like they didn't learn anything about fertility awareness-based methods, but like 90% or higher said that they could teach you one of the fertility awareness um, chart. Like they could teach you the one of the symptoms. Like they could teach you to track your temperature or whatever. So like even though fully 30 to 40% never learned about it, that's what they said. Like
Mhm.
90 something percent were like, yeah, but I could teach you about it.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, and like it was so I guess what I'm getting at is like, and if anyone's offended by me calling this out, it's not me, it's the study.
Right.
What I gathered from that, which matches people's experience, is like doctors are super overconfident with their knowledge of everything, even if they weren't taught it.
Mhm.
And we have to be very cautious about our own expectations because we need to understand what they specialize in and what they don't. And it just means we have to have a healthcare team. It's not to knock doctors. Doctors are really good at what they're trained in. And so when we are dealing with an issue specific to, and if we want that type of care, so if you know that it's allopathic medicine and you want symptom management,
Mhm.
and you're aware that the symptom management isn't necessarily going to address the root cause, then that's going to align with what you want.
Yes.
But if you really actually would prefer to take a nutritional approach or to take a more functional approach and find out those answers,
Holistic. Yeah. Mhm.
then you're going to you can have your doctor on your team, but you have to know the limitations. And then you also would need to broaden your team to make sure that you include a functional provider, to include the nutritionist, to include the fertility awareness professional so that you can get like the broad type of care that you actually want.
Yeah, that is beautifully said. Thank you. I mean, that's great. Um, all right. Uh, it so much helps put things into a realistic perspective. And you know, I will admit I never thought to explain it in the way that using your analogy that you're at your doctor's asking for something completely different than what they're capable of doing if you truly are asking for something out of an allopathic take this pill answer. So yeah, that's great. All right. Well, you have been so generous with your time. So as we sort of wrap up here, let's talk about you know, like just so people have already learned a lot about you, but to get more of a personal take into your life, what are some things that you do, some daily, whether it be food or movement activities that you do in your day that you would not give up for anything, maybe, and that you really place a lot of value on in optimizing your own health?
Oh, that's a great question. So I want to preface it by saying I'm not perfect. Like I feel like
Mm,
that's useful because I think people can put you on a pedestal and,
mhm.
but I've also been at this for a long time. So I think
Yeah.
the longer that you do the things, and I've been charting my cycles as well. And I say that because one of the things personally that I have found with charting my cycles over all of these years is you do become attuned to what your body needs. And it becomes, I always say, like before you were charting, it was like a one-way conversation. Like your body was giving you symptoms, but you weren't paying attention. But then when you start charting now, it can be like a two-way conversation. So you have like a high PMS cycle. And then you're like, oh, maybe I should actually remember to sleep. And then you sleep. And then, like, so you're in a conversation. So I just want to preface it with that because I've had a lot of experience actually paying attention to what my body needs. So I'm in a lot more awareness of what that actually is. So, first and foremost, I mean, I really prioritize food. I prioritize getting my 3 meals a day. I don't I save I always say I save my caffeine for special occasions. So I don't drink caffeinated beverages on a regular
Mhm.
basis, but like if I ever
Mhm.
need to go on that trip and the kids kept me up all night, then I'll use it then. So then nothing is interfering with my appetite and I'm able to actually pay attention to when I'm hungry. So that's something where I make sure to eat in the mornings, a high protein breakfast. I make sure to find time to eat lunch again, really prioritizing balanced macros and having like a really solid, dinner. And so that's something that is a non-negotiable. Like I said, it doesn't mean it's always perfect, but it's
Mhm.
always there. And I
Mhm.
have backups that are very useful for those days that are really busy. So I might have like those protein filled backups for when I can't have that kind of perfect lunch.
Mhm.
I would also say, in terms of movement, so I'm not the biggest exerciser. I call myself a lazy exerciser, but as I've gotten older, I do prioritize some weight bearing activities. So I'll
Mhm.
usually get in my like 5, 10 minutes of like doing something with the kettlebell or something like
Right.
that so that I'm not totally stressing my body and I'm not hardcore. So, it
Yeah.
is what it is, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I get it in. And
Mhm.
I have a walking, like underneath me is my treadmill. So I actually do walk and work sometimes.
Mhm.
And I do it for different reasons. So for me personally, sitting all day working at home, sometimes I can have issues with my neck and my back and stuff. So part of it is literally just movement so
Mhm.
that I can keep loosening up my body. Let me
Mhm.
think of what else. Sleep is really important.
Yeah. Mhm.
So I have 3 children. So I have a 12-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 2.5-year-old.
Yeah.
So that's not perfect either, but I do my best to get into bed early, sleeping in a dark room. I really, because it's so important. I can't function without sleep. And like I said, I don't drink coffee, so I really actually need to have the natural energy.
Mhm.
And there are certain things I do with my own kind of supplement routine. So I did have this history of painful periods, which is largely a non-issue these days, which is fantastic.
I
But
was
I
going to
do,
ask. Yeah.
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 Well, I mean, over the years, I just learned so much more about nutrition and really focusing on eating in a way that is non-inflammatory. I used to joke that when I was in high school, it was like gummy candies were a food group, like
Right.
I was,
Right.
I went
I
through my
read lots
childhood.
of colors.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So I mean, balancing my macronutrients, focusing on real food has made a huge, huge impact. And so in addition to that, I mean, I don't have loads and loads and loads of crazy supplements all the time, but I will focus in on certain things, that are specifically anti-inflammatory, things like magnesium or turmeric or zinc, and often targeted at certain times of my cycle to really encourage those lovely periods that are painless, which
Mhm.
is obviously preferable
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
alternative.
Yeah.
So those
Right.
are a few things that I would say focus on. And then I mean, I could talk about it a little bit more, but I do cook um, in a certain way as well. So, myself, my children, we eat liver a lot, so they actually love it.
Hmm.
When I make pate, I haven't made pate in a little while because it's been a busy season, so we've been buying it. My son's like, "It's been so long since you made pate. You need to make
Mm.
pate again." So we
Mm.
do eat a lot of nutrient-dense foods. I love doing my soups and stews. I regularly make chicken broth. We usually cook like at least 2 to 3 whole chickens every week, and so I always save the carcass.
The
And
bones.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just kind of a lifestyle. And I like to buy the chicken feet. I know that kind of grosses
Hmm.
people out, but it makes the
No.
best
Yeah.
broth.
Hmm. Hmm.
So lots of that kind of stuff that is just a part of my day to day, which is great.
Yeah. Love it. Um, So another thing that I find interesting, and I'm interested to hear what you think about this in your future. So a lot of times people focus on the, their focus on health or, whatever has to do with where they're at in their stage of life because that's their personal experience. So I'm curious, as you age and age out of having cycles, if you foresee that yourself putting a lot more emphasis on menopause and those kinds of things, because, I am like within like throwing a stone distance to being 60 years old. And so I am no longer having cycles. I am postmenopausal. And, so that's really where I put a lot of my personal emphasis. Do you foresee that as you age, you'll sort of transition into away from maybe not completely away from fertility because of course you're an expert and that's, you're well known for that. But do you see yourself transitioning into writing books about menopause?
Well, so we'll see about the book thing. I joked that after Real Food for Fertility, it took Lily and I 3 years to write the book, and it was
Uh-huh.
like really intense. And my daughter is 2.5, as I mentioned. So, like, she was born in the middle of writing this book. So, it was a very intense time.
Yeah.
So, I joked that I had post book trauma syndrome, and we'll see when I recover, right?
Yeah,
Um,
right.
but I mean, one thing I do know is that I have strong opinions on a lot of things. Every time you ask me a question, you could tell, you're like, I don't know if you have a thought on this. I'm like, I
Yeah.
definitely do. So I feel
Yeah.
like I feel like with the menopause conversation, it's already started to come up. I mean, I'm 42, so I still have some cycling years ahead of me, I'm sure. But I've started to notice some changes, of course, as I get a little bit older, and just right in line with the research. As I get creeping up into the 40s, like it's easier for me to put
Mhm.
on weight, and I
Right.
don't have as much resilience. I can't just. This is why sleep is so important to me. This is why you kind of get into your routines because I just don't like feeling bad. I like feeling great. I like having good energy. People comment on that sometimes, like you have so much energy. So,
Mhm.
but it's changed, right? It changes over the years. So, in terms of my focus, I still find that after all these years, I'm still really excited to talk about fertility awareness and charting. I don't think there's a lot of people who kind of get excited about it and then, you know, they kind of move on. So for some
Mhm.
reason, still, I think it's because I'm always diving into the research. There's always a new interesting research topic and all of that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So naturally, I think it'll weave more into my work. One thing I can say is that I do have a different perspective. So not surprising. I do have a different perspective than the kind of dominant perspective these days on menopause. It's been very interesting to watch
Mhm.
So much talk about menopause just
Yep.
explode out of nowhere.
Yep.
Just everyone's different opinions, and especially the heavy focus on HRT. I do feel that I don't want to start going on about it before I've actually
Mhm.
gone through some of it, because I think that
Mhm.
that would be short-sighted.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
keep me
No,
announced.
I just was curious, like, do you foresee that that will be something that becomes more of a focus of your research and efforts? And
I
obviously
feel like it,
you can't
yeah.
predict the
But I
future,
think
but
it naturally will, because
yeah.
who,
I just feel like that's a natural progression for people. They kind of
yeah.
focus on what they're doing in their own life, and you know, I'm looking forward to reading whatever you write about it, because you know, you'll have to catch up to me, but you know, that is what I'm like reading a lot about now,
Yeah.
and
Well,
getting all
and
the different perspectives.
when I think about it from my inexperience, having not gone through it perspective now, but from my perspective of having charted for 2 decades and
Right.
charted through pregnancy and breastfeeding, there's a lot of issues that women start experiencing in their 40s when the hormones start to change,
Yes.
that I'm not necessarily experiencing, or that a lot of women who might be like, there's a so I have this, so we'll to be announced, but I feel that at this, and I just am prefacing it again, I've not gone through it, so don't throw stones
Mhm.
at me. But I just feel like when we look at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, then women who are experiencing the absolute worst,
Mhm.
premenopause symptoms, if
Mhm.
we were to go in and assess those factors, we would
Mhm.
find a lot of opportunity. Like you said earlier, I don't think that the nutrition is going to be the whole solution, or like
Yeah.
the
It's
different factors. But I
yeah.
think that when you address a lot of those foundational things, a lot of the problems, like a huge percentage of those problems, can be improved, like kind of like the 80-20 rule. That's
Mhm.
been my experience over the years working with women with charting their cycles, where you go into it thinking, oh my goodness, she has this, whatever it is going on in her cycle, this
Mhm.
irregular this, or,
Mhm.
abnormal that. But
Mhm.
then you look at all the foundational stuff, and then it's like, well, there's quite a bit of room for improvement here. And then when you address a lot of that stuff, she might still have some of those issues, but they're far less problematic once you've
Yeah.
addressed a lot of that. So that's kind of my hypothesis, not to
Mhm.
minimize anyone's experience, but we just live in a culture where people are, first of all, very uncomfortable with transition and change.
Yes.
We are confused, I think, as a culture, as to
Mhm.
what
Mhm.
menopause is. Like,
Mhm.
because half of the stuff about it would make it seem like it's an illness,
Mhm.
except that it's a natural transition.
Right.
So,
Right.
and then a lot of the
Exactly.
attention is literally towards a phase of transition,
Mhm.
almost as though we're not even supposed to go through a transition.
Mhm.
Like if you compare it to puberty, when I was like 12, or whenever I started growing the breast buds, like 10, I didn't just like wake up with breasts. It took a few
Mhm.
years for this to happen. I was
Mhm.
waiting very impatiently. And so,
Mhm. Right. Right.
and so, so I have a lot of questions. I think at this stage I have more questions, but I feel like there's certainly room for another perspective that isn't so like, I don't know,
Mhm. Mhm.
conventional.
Yeah. Well, you know, perimenopause and those changes that happen in your cycle, which are the biggest sort of reflection of the fact that you're going through perimenopause, it is pretty wild. And, you know, even when it was, you know, so 15 years ago, with what I knew at the time, I still did not know what to expect.
Yeah.
Um, and so you know, I think that because you are coming into it, having charted for so long, you will already have a certain level of knowledge and observation that maybe will make it an easier transition for you. I hope so. I hope for you.
Well, I don't know if it'll make it easy, but one of the things I think, like you said, there's a lot of conversation about the symptoms,
Hmm.
but there's not a lot of people specifically talking about what changes from a menstrual cycle perspective and what to expect and how to deal with that specific piece of it. And
Mhm.
so I've worked with a fair number of clients who have been in that age range, 40s to
Mhm.
50s,
Mhm.
and it's just like it hits them out of the blue, like poof.
Yeah.
But most of the clients I've worked with, they hadn't charted their cycles for a
Yeah.
significant time. And I think of this one client that I had, and she was on the pill for like 30 years.
Wow.
Then she came
Yeah.
off the pill, and then somewhere within a year or two of her coming off the pill, she had all the
Right.
heavy bleeding and like all this.
Exactly.
But like when you're on the pill, you don't have the subtle changes of your I think of your menstrual cycle as a teacher. So you could be doing stuff like you could be working out like 6 days a week, doing like spin class and like not eating enough. But if you're on the pill, you just get this bleed every four
Yeah.
weeks. And it's like, but if you weren't on the pill, you would see some cycle issues and it would alert you to like, oh my goodness, what is going on? And you potentially would be
Yeah.
more motivated to make some changes. If you literally had no conversation at all with your menstrual cycle, and then all of a sudden you're like 48 and like everything's going haywire. Well, yeah, because you've never had to admit that you have limitations. You've never had to adjust your behavior. You've never had to face the fact that your body actually needs you to change stuff in order for it to work properly. That's my theory.
Yeah.
Like this is where I'm
I
coming
love
from.
it. I love it. It's great. It's awesome. Yeah. I wish I'd known you through all of my stages of my life. So, all right. Well, I will say it one more time. You've been so generous with your time. Thank you so much. It has been a really wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed it so much. And sorry, I keep asking questions because, things just keep popping into my head that I think you would be a great resource for. So, but let's finish it up so you can get back to your day. How can people connect with you? Where do you want them to find you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much again for having me. I loved your questions. It's so fun when I get just different questions all, outside of what I usually get. So it gave
Right.
me an opportunity to share all kinds of interesting stuff. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for more about me, if you enjoyed today's conversation, then you'll likely enjoy my podcast as well. You can type Fertility Friday into your favorite podcast player and you will find me. I have a really interesting and fun resource for women's health professionals called How to Interpret Virtually Any Chart Your Client Throws at You. So for anyone who's wanting to dive deeper into the charting rabbit holes, you can find that at fertilityfriday.com/chart. And I mean, we've mentioned some of the resources. So, of course, my books, The Fifth Vital Sign is my first book. So, I mean, you can get the first chapter free, thefifthvitalsignbook.com, or you can just search it and it's on Amazon. Um, Real Food for Fertility is my latest book, co-authored with Lily Nichols. We just celebrated our 1 year anniversary, and honestly, that book it's data packed enough to be a textbook, but we write in a very conversational way, so you don't feel like you're like reading a textbook, but you get
Mm.
just a ton of really interesting research and everything. And again, first chapter for free, realfoodforfertility.com, and we also recorded like both of the books are available in audio. So if you're into listening to audio,
Yeah.
those are
Mhm.
available on Audible as well.
Great. Lovely. All right. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for your time today. I am so pleased to have been able to meet you and have this conversation, and so pleased that you're out there doing this work because it is definitely necessary as we've talked about. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much.
All right. Bye. Hi, Diane Kaler here again. If you found this conversation interesting and haven't already become a student at NTI, check us out at ntischool.com. We hope to see you soon.